talk about, I'm not going to talk about different people or funding specifically. I'm just going to dive into some of the stories. All right. I assume if somebody can't hear me or the technical stuff goes bad, somebody will pop up and say something. But the story that I'm going to tell starts in 2011 with Hall Sawyer and the BLM. And in about this time, the BLM asked Hall Sawyer to study what they thought was a herd of mule deer that lived out in the kind of rough desert of the Red Desert. And the BLM was like, kind of how do these animals live out their lives in this really, kind of the roughest desert of Wyoming? And so Hall Sawyer put a number of collars out on mule deer in the winter of 2010, 2011. And a lot of our work, if you don't know, we use these collars on animals and they take GPS locations every couple of hours on these animals. So we get these kind of paths of where these animals go for a few years of their life. And so Hall put those collars out, and then these were what we call store on board. And so the data were all on the collar until the end of the study, and then all the collars fell off. Hall went out into the field, picked the collars up, brought them back to his office, downloaded the data and plotted it on a map. And what was quite surprising is that not many of these animals actually stayed their whole life in the Red Desert. And basically what was discovered was the longest migrating mule deer that we knew about. And we had the paths of these animals all mapped out with these GPS collars. So this was a very exciting time for migration in Wyoming, kind of kicking up, finding this long mule deer migration, 150 miles. And this time was right about when the Wyoming Migration Initiative was kind of born, when this was discovered and we learned about this. And so 2014 was about when the Wyoming Migration Initiative got started. Okay, we'll come back to this many times throughout this talk, as you all probably have seen maps of this migration. So real quick, what is ungulate migration? And when we think about it from an ungulate standpoint, it's very similar to birds. We simply think about it as the back and forth seasonal movement between distinct seasonal ranges. And that's it. So it's movement between two different areas, usually reoccurring again and again throughout the year. And we have animals in Wyoming, especially mule deer, that walk on the same paths back and forth each year. It's like birds that'll migrate to South America and come back and nest in the same tree or in the same little area each year. And migration isn't just here in Wyoming and in the West. Migration can be found in pretty much all continents in the world. The ungulate migration, at least, can be found in all continents of the world, from reindeer in Russia, and, red deer and roe deer in Europe, and wildebeest in the Serengeti, making this huge figure-8 migration that's just unbelievable. And so migration is everywhere. It's exciting to see. And the other cool thing is it's not a new thing. Migrations have been around for thousands of years, and I always love talking about some of the discoveries here in Wyoming at the Trapper's Point, which is just west of Pinedale, and recovering old bones from pronghorn and looking at the size of those bones suggests that a lot of the animals that died there were during the spring migration and the fall migration, because during spring, pronghorn are pregnant, and so the fetal bones that they find there kind of fit with that timing. And then in the fall, when the animals are migrating, there's young fawns at heel, or at least fawns moving with, they tend to die at that spot in that period of time. And so it suggests that these migrations have been around for thousands of years. And so that's kind of a fun little tidbit that we have in Wyoming, because we have some of this kind of history of migration here. So why do these animals migrate? Well, it's pretty simple in Wyoming. Generally, it's the solution to our world of mountains and plains. And basically, as we all know, our mountains get way more precipitation, can be way more productive than the plains. And the problem is all these animals would probably love to live their whole life in the mountains, but the winter can be quite rough and basically inhospitable for many ungulates. Maybe a moose can live in our mountains year round. And so the solution is basically to move out of those mountains and live down in the valley bottoms where you could say the winter is more tolerable. And so this is kind of, the migration is the solution to this situation we have in Wyoming, where the best productive places are not hospitable year round. But in the research that we've been doing, we've learned that it's actually more than that. It's not just the animals going back and forth between these two areas. It's actually the migration routes and the corridors themselves are what is important for these animals. And potentially many of you have heard about the green wave hypothesis or the green wave idea. And we all know it. We all kind of think about it all the time, the idea that things green up or spring occurs earlier at lower elevations, and then it spring slowly moves forward as you go up in elevation. It's the same with latitudes. Spring happens earlier, typically near the equators, and then it moves northward throughout spring. This is what birds tend to do. And in fact, the green wave hypothesis was actually originally developed by ornithologists observing birds bouncing between different stopover areas during spring migration. And so we've done a bunch of research demonstrating that mule deer and some other big game in Wyoming tend to match their migrations with the timing of that spring green up as it moves up in elevation. And more than that, we've done one study that actually demonstrates that this behavior actually gives these animals more fat. And so this is some elk data from the Cody area. And on the bottom of this graph, you have green wave surfing index. So on the left, it's good surfing, so animals that are doing well. And on the right, it's poor surfing, so they didn't really follow the green up very well. And on the y-axis, you have September body fat. And what we find is the animals that are better at migrating and moving in concert with that green wave tend to be fatter at the end of summer compared to the animals that don't really do that work very well. So this is a good thing. And fat is the key for our big game to make it through the winter, to raise young and kind of contribute to the population. And then the other cool finding that we have, and I'm kind of cherry picking some of the funnest stuff, is that how this migration developed is not just an easy old put animals on the landscape and they're going to migrate. And so this is some results from an analysis of a bunch of moose and bighorn sheep herds. And as we know, bighorn sheep and moose have been translocated across the state and then around the West. And so we could look at herds and how long it's been since they've been translocated and look at what percent of those populations were migratory. And what we find is this result that when animals are just reintroduced onto the landscape or just translocated into a new area, they typically don't migrate. And migration takes multiple decades to develop. And so that's amazing. You know, there's probably information transfer between different individuals, mother to young, whatever. But the point here from a conservation perspective is that if we lose migration, it's going to take decades to restore it because animals don't just migrate when you dump them back onto the landscape. And what's interesting about this, thinking about birds, is that there are a number of birds that migrate based on genetics. They have this interest in flying north in the spring and flying south in the fall based on circadian rhythms and their genetics. But there are a few species of birds like these big game that actually have to learn their migration. And so that's where big game fall out on the spectrum of animals of learned versus innate in migration. Okay, so I just gave you a few little fun tidbits about migration, what it looks like, how these animals migrate, why they migrate, and how they get to these long migrations that we see. And so that's quite fun, and we should all be very happy that we live in Wyoming because we get to see some of the longest migrations in the world, in fact. But when you start looking at this, there are a few roads on this map, but you can start to think that these migrations, how are we going to see these migrations into the future? And so if you switch this map and you put the land ownership on the background, you start noticing that these migrations aren't just fun and games and following the green wave. These animals are taking on quite a wild journey. Just this migration, these animals pass in and out of 50 different private landowners. They jump over 100 fences. They cross a few highways. They hit all of the different federal and state land ownerships, just going one way. And so they do all that work. And even some of those fences can be tough to cross, and they have to go around them. And we know we've seen animals crossing the road, and I know you guys in Jackson are seeing animals crossing the road all the time. But even more broadly than that, we have some urban development in Wyoming that kind of interacts with some of these migrations. Fences, and we all know the story about pronghorn and how fences are quite tough for pronghorn. And then there's also energy development, probably one of the biggest kind of development components of our state. And we've done a lot of research looking at how development influences these animals. We know that influences them on winter range, and we're starting to begin to learn how it influences them during migration. And we understand that they start to speed up and they sometimes detour around the development. And so it affects them behaviorally. And so we know these things are affecting these animals at some level. And so when we come back to this and start thinking, okay, there's effect, or there's humans are affecting these migrations at some level. How are we actually going to sit down and try to manage or conserve this 100-mile path across the landscape? Sure, it's really easy if the animals lived in a 1 square mile area, but this is 150 miles of traversing that they need to be able to do. And so this is where kind of some of the Wyoming Migration Initiative has been really key in us moving forward with the conservation of migrations, is by taking the steps to help facilitate conservation and management. And what that means is we have to first dig into some of the biology or some of the statistics, math of the movements themselves. And so I told you that these collars take a GPS location every hour or every 2 hours for a few years for these animals. And so what we can do is we can plot those points in sequential time and connect them by a line. And that kind of tells us where the animals go. The problem is you can zoom in on a line or a point to infinity, and there's no space around that line or point. And when there's conservation action needing to be done, we need to know where exactly is the conservation action going to be done. So we need some kind of spatial representation, a polygon, some kind of idea of where, or the width of the lines, or where they go, where these animals go. And so we go back into the books of animal movement biology and movement ecology, and we can use statistics to tell us the probability of where the animals could have gone between the points. And what that does is it gives us this new dimension, this kind of second dimension of the migration. And it also tells us where the animals spend time during migration. We call them stopovers, same as in the bird literature. These are the places the animals usually use to forage during migration or rest during migration. So very important for instance, that green wave surfing. These are the areas that they forage and eat during spring. And then in between the stopovers is the movement corridor. And that's what we're really keying in on and making sure is free of obstruction so the animals can move through there. And so these analysis methods can help us take what sometimes is a million GPS points, kind of really hard to even know what to do with it on a map, help us turn it into lines, and then turn it into something that we can use in conservation. For instance, a map of stopover habitat. These are the areas that most of the animals in this herd use to forage. And then we can start to stack together the individual animals to create what we call corridors at the population or the herd level. And once you stack these animals up, you can start to identify, okay, these are the areas where most of the animals migrate. These are the areas where less animals migrate. And then the outskirts, maybe we can prioritize less. And so it gives us this key kind of two-dimension mapping ability of where the animals go, and then helps us prioritize where the most important places are. And once we have these maps, then we can get to work. We can sit down with local biologists, with landowners, with people on the ground that know the details of the landscapes, and pour through these maps mile by mile and start to pinpoint and identify the places where either there's potential threats or conservation opportunities. And so in about 15 or 16 or so, this Red Desert to Hoback migration assessment came out, which basically poured through the Red Desert to Hoback migration, mile by mile, identifying the threats to the migration, and then ranking those threats in a way that would help prioritize conservation and management. And maybe potentially many of you have heard this story, but one of the top things that came out is that these animals moved through this little pinch point between Fremont Lake and the town of Pinedale, and they moved through a piece of property that was basically for sale. And this is back in, I think, 2015 or somewhere around there. That was for sale to be potentially developed for lakeside cottages or small ranches. And because we had the maps, we were able to very clearly show that a couple thousand animals are going through this area, and that piece of property is a prime piece that could potentially cause a lot of grief to this migration. And so it was very easy to get a lot of support, both financially and kind of conservation wise, to purchase this property and turn it into a wildlife habitat management area. And so this was a big win and super exciting with respect to how the maps could help facilitate kind of conservation in a really high level. And up in the upper right, you'll see that there was also an old elk fence, or an elk fence that was kind of interacting with the corridor, and the BLM biologist in the area had a camera on this fence that took pictures of like thousands of deer going around this fence every year. And so with the mapping and with that camera information, it was very clear that we could make a very small change to the fence that would really help this migration. And so all these things are were born out of the fact that we can map this and see where these animals migrate in space. And so right after this occurred, within the next couple of years ago, another big thing happened. Wyoming Game and Fish adopts this wildlife migration conservation guidelines. They changed their policy to actually incorporate migrations into their habitat management or their vital habitat program. And so what this did is it basically provided this streamline. So migration corridors, using some of the methods that I showed you, are now a part of the habitat management of game and fish. And one of the most important things is now, once Game and Fish recognizes migration corridors as important habitat, they will now be incorporated in federal land policy or federal land management. And so these migration corridors are now something on the map when there's things like energy development coming in. And so this was a big win and quite an exciting time. This was January of 2016, and kind of a big win for migration. And so let me jump you back, and we're going to jump into the field a little bit and think about, we just had this win with Wyoming Game and Fish developing this new policy. And we were capturing animals in that same red desert area just north of Rock Springs. And we always, we've continued to monitor this population for many years, and we're still monitoring it now. And we always capture a few new individuals every winter and put some new collars out and see where these animals go. Well, we put some new collars out in March of 2016, and then in May of 2016, I was actually the person that downloaded the collar data at that time. And now the technology improved. We could download it from the internet. We didn't actually have to have the collars in hand. And so I downloaded the data, and I saw the typical movements of these animals, but there was something big and something different that I saw. And there was one animal that not only did this 150-mile migration, but she continued on, and this animal went all the way into Idaho and basically changed the scale of what we thought of as a huge long migration for a mule deer. And so this was a really exciting time. I remember telling Matt Kaufman, I said, check this out. This is unbelievable. You're not going to believe this. And so it was kind of this, period of discovery and excitement of this new animal that went, basically shattered the old record of mule deer migration. But then about June, we quit hearing from the caller. The caller basically broke, and we couldn't, we weren't getting any relocations from it anymore. And we weren't sure. And what that meant was that we weren't sure if this was actually a migration or if it was just a dispersal event. And basically Wyoming just gave a deer to Idaho. And so Matt Kaufman and I actually went to the summer range of this animal to make sure she was still alive. We just wanted to make sure she was still alive and still had the collar. And there's a little thing called a VHF transmitter on these collars that gives a little beep, and we can pick it up with a transmitter. And that was still working. So we were able to find her, and we actually got a picture. I got this picture of what is now known as deer 255, and deer 255, and you may know the story, but I'm going to kind of leave it to the end of the talk. But I did get a picture of her, and she was still alive, and so we knew she was still out there, but we never heard from the caller anymore that year. And so I'll come back to this story in a little bit. So that was summer of 2016. And then right when 2018 started, so just a year and a half after that, Secretary Zinke, so then Secretary Zinke of the Department of Interior, signed the secretarial order prioritizing big game corridors and winter range. And basically this was in February of 2018. And this basically told the agencies within the Department of Interior, like the Park Service, BLM, Fish and Wildlife Service, to work with the states in close collaboration and prioritize and conserve big game migration corridors and rhino range for elk, deer, and pronghorn. And so this kind of set in motion at this federal level some conservation kind of mandate and prioritization. It also brought some funding, and I'll show you in just a little bit what that kind of moved forward. But it brought some funding to each state, and then it brought some funding to the USGS, is where the Western Migration Corridor Mapping Team came from. Before I go there, remember, this was in February of 2018. And so the next month, we were back down in Rock Springs, capturing animals. And we always tell the helicopter pilot who captures the animals from the air, we always say, if you see an animal with a collar out there, and if it's not working, if the collar is broken, go grab it and bring it into us. And we want to know, because it's very important for our research to get longitudinal data on these animals, so we know the lifetime of these animals. Well, I'll never forget it. I was in the field. I think maybe we had a deer or something. I was putting a collar on another deer. And I hear on the radio from the helicopter pilot that we picked up an animal with a collar that is not working. And he read off the serial number on the collar, and it wasn't 255, but it was a different number on the collar. And the graduate student, I'll never forget this, it's Anna Ortega, maybe a couple of you have met her. She looked over at me and she said, "That's deer 255. And so right then we knew that this animal was a migrating animal because we captured her back down here by Rock Springs. And so the helicopter pilot brought 255 back in. This is March 2018. We looked around, found the shiniest, fanciest collar, and put a new collar on deer 255. And sure enough, she did the exact same migration again that spring of 2018. And so it was very exciting to kind of tie this story together. And as you probably have all seen some of the videos of deer 255 and her story, she's still alive today. She hasn't always migrated all the way to Idaho, but she's still done one of the longest migrations of this group of animals that winter in the Red Desert. So exciting times. Okay, jumping back to the Western migration. So in response to that secretarial order from the Department of Interior, it brought some funding to USGS. And basically, clearly the USGS was kind of in a position, because we've already been here in Wyoming, been doing a lot of the migration mapping. We knew some of the processes with that. Wyoming was good at least was the first state to start developing policy. And so that brought Matt Kaufman some in the USGS and the co-op unit some funds to try to bring together all the states to start to map the data that they had for these migrations. And so that's where the corridor mapping team started from. And at that time in 2018, it was basically just me and Matt Kaufman and Hal Sawyer, and then a few people from Idaho and a few people from Arizona. But once it got going, basically now we have all of the Western states are involved at some level, and it's a pretty exciting time. We have weekly meetings. It's basically a bunch of data nerds and ungulate biologists sitting together talking about migrations and thinking about, you know, what is this animal doing and why is it doing that? It's just it's a really exciting time, and folks are putting together these maps and analyzing their data to be used in conservation and management. And I'll just give you a little taste of some of the things that we've been doing. So scoot a little closer to your computer here. I'm going to show you some fun maps of different migrations. So this is in northern Washington. This is a mule deer herd that winters down kind of west of Okanagan and then migrates to the northwest. And this is the first kind of mapped mule deer migration that crosses international borders. And not all the animals go up into British Columbia, but a few do. And so this is an exciting kind of map that kind of demonstrates our connection to our neighbors to the north. Here's another mule deer migration. I've already shown you some maps of this one. These mule deer winter in northern New Mexico, near Navajo Lake, and then they migrate to the northeast. A lot of this is in the Southern Ute Reservation. And then they migrate to the northeast into the San Juan Mountains in Colorado. So this is a clear interstate migration and kind of a cool migration of how much, I mean, the range of elevations that these animals migrate is pretty wild. This is another interstate migration. So these animals winter in southern Idaho and northern Utah and then migrate north into Idaho, into the Caribou and Aspen range. And then some of them actually go into Wyoming as well. So another kind of multi-state, 3 states involved in this migration. And then going into a national park, this is the bison migration of Yellowstone National Park. And there's a couple of different things, but as you all know, bisons tend to start leaving the park in late winter. And so they start their migration. They kind of do their fall migration in late winter because they stay on summer range as long as they can. And then as the snow accumulates, they start moving out of the park or to the edges of the park. And then once the snow melts, they start doing their spring migration to higher elevations in the park. And so that's kind of fun one, connecting federal lands to state lands, or national park lands to state lands. And then here's another one that I'm going to show you a bit later too. This is in northern Nevada. This is another mule deer migration. And this migration has been key in the placement of some over and underpasses on Interstate 80 in northern Nevada. And I'll show you more detail on that in just a little bit. But kind of an interesting migration that really is kind of championed. I'm sure you've heard about some of the over and underpasses for these animals in northern Nevada. And then finally, this is an exciting one showing mule deer captured on the Wind River Reservation that migrate out of the reservation to summer ranges in the Wind River Mountains and also all the way in Grand Teton National Park. And so it demonstrates this really neat connection between the Wind River Reservation and Grand Teton National Park and everything in between. Okay, so that's just kind of like a little thumbnail sketch of some of the migrations. And these are all what I just showed you in that volume 1. And there's 48 migrations in that first volume that came out just over a year ago. And just volume 2, which is going to have another 64 herds in it, is coming out this month, in another month or so, or this month. And so you'll see that, and we'll see a new document, and more maps will be coming out. And then what we're basically working on now is volume 3, which is planned to come out in December, but we're working on that all right now with another 45 herds. And so if you count all these up, this is about what it looks like across different states and tribes. And so what we can see here is that you see a lot of orange. So a lot of the migrations that are mapped are mule deer. We also see a lot of blue. So there's a lot of elk migrations mapped. And the other neat thing that we see here is that it's not just Wyoming that's mapping a lot of migrations. We have Idaho, we have California has a whole bunch of neat migrations, and I'll show you some broader maps here in a second. We have 2 tribes that are mapping their migrations, along with a number of different states in the West. So exciting time to see all these maps going in across the West. And this is what it looks like on paper for now. So Arizona has these in kind of northern Arizona, southern Utah. Colorado has that migration I showed you, and New Mexico is really coming online with a number of different elk migrations. A lot of those migrations in California are over here on the east slope of the Sierra Nevadas, and then a few interstate migrations between California and Oregon. That one in northern Washington I showed you is up here. Just so you know, Utah has a whole bunch of migrations already mapped, and you can see them on their website too. And so they're just coming on, and they'll be mapping more and more of theirs with this kind of broader effort soon. So anyway, there's a lot of holes, and we can see that there's a lot in Wyoming, but we're making a lot of progress, and a lot of these are being mapped across the West. So it's a very exciting time. And one of the most important things for conservation and management is that all of these derived products, whether it's lines or polygons of these migrations, most of them are being kind of put on this website where they're available to anybody that wants to use them, or just view them for fun, or use them in conservation or management. And there's a viewer, if you want to go to westernmigrations.net. If you're a nerd like me and want to just put up some migrations and zoom in and look at where these animals walk and move, you can totally do that with migrations all over the West. And so that's where the kind of a front end public interface is. And then you can see there's a button there to download if you want to actually download these data off of the website itself. So here's a couple of conservation success stories that have connected with the migration mapping. So this is that migration in northern Nevada. You can see it coming out kind of from the south here, and then it has that big curve to the west. And this is where this big migration crosses I-80, and this is where some bunch of under and overpasses have been put in. And then over here, it's also helped identify where some underpasses have been put in up there. And so this is a cool story where how clearly the mapping is lining up with helping us where we can put the over and underpasses. And then this is a map of some pronghorn migration and movement in central and northern Arizona. And the red areas are where these pronghorn move between the green areas, which the green areas are more of their kind of general ranges. And there's been a lot of effort to open up the kind of woody encroachment in the trees and open it back to grassland for pronghorn. And the places outside of this main area on the west have been, the GPS collar data and the migration corridor of these pronghorn has helped identify where to put some of this habitat treatment in this migration corridor here. And so that's exciting. And then kind of stepping back, this is a map of the upper green, and you're kind of, if you can imagine going straight, actually, if you were like on the top of the Grand, looking towards Pinedale, which is right here, this is kind of what you would see. Maybe not the exact angle, but it's close. And what I'm showing you here in purple is the migration route of deer 255. And then the white is private lands. And then the green are all conservation easements, mainly put in through the some of the sage grouse initiative work in this area. And so what it shows us is we can, one, that this deer 255 is using some of these easements, walking across them, but also helps us guide where we can put these maybe future easements for conservation as well. And so zooming into the map of our migrations here in Wyoming, this is kind of the current, the current amalgamation of data that we have, but we're still doing collaring. I mean, our goal is basically to fill in all the holes and see where all the migrations are. There's, I forgot, there's another slide here. So this is the data that we have. And then this is where, what's going on here? Okay, this is where Wyoming Game and Fish has designated corridors. And so if I flip back, we have a lot more data than what is actually designated by Wyoming Game and Fish. And so there's a lot of momentum with the data and the mapping, but obviously it's a little bit slower to actually get these migration corridors integrated into that policy, into that habitat program. And so keep that in mind as well, is that the data are moving fast, and Wyoming is just getting, waterboarded with new data sets and new data coming on, but they're moving as fast as they can to bring these online as well. And like I said, moving fast, this is where we're at. And this is all the studies that are basically happening right now. And so all the places I just circled are where new collaring studies have started within the last couple of years or so. I'm going to show you a bit of the Uinta data that we've just collected. Grand Teton is working with Idaho to fill in some gaps west of the Tetons. There's a new pronghorn herd by Cody that we just collected a whole bunch of data on. The data are just coming out. There's a lot of effort right now in the bighorns. The Wind River Reservation is collecting a whole bunch of cool data on mule deer there. Shirley Basin pronghorn, some more data on red desert pronghorn. Wyoming Game and Fish is also capturing a bunch of pronghorn south of Pinedale to kind of fill in some of the gaps in there. So a lot going on even currently, and so we should see even more migrations coming online. I don't know if anybody's from the southwest corner of Wyoming or interested, but this is a little taste of some data from the Uinta project. So we captured animals on the north and south side of Interstate 80. Some of them migrate north and mix in with some of the Wyoming range migrations. Some of them are migrating south into Utah. And some of these animals are actually crossing I-80. I can't remember if it's actually crossing or if there's some underpasses right in that area. And there are also some crossing of 89 as well, Highway 89 as well. This is kind of interesting. We're going to jump up to the Bighorns now. This is right at the Montana-Wyoming border. And we've collared mule deer on both the west and the east side of the Bighorns. And what we find is all the animals collared during winter on the west side, many of them migrate up into the Bighorns during summer, and we only have found one resident animal that stayed on winter range year round. But if you go on the east side of the Bighorns, it's mostly residents and just a few migrations that go up into the Bighorns. So kind of an interesting thing that we're already finding there between the west and the east side of the Bighorn Mountains. There's going to be a new project with Game and Fish and Hall Sawyer putting some collars out in that kind of paint rock area just south of where we have data now. And so coming back together here, I've shown you a lot of the history, some of the history of where we're at today. And I just want to leave you off on a couple of final thoughts and kind of an overview of what I showed you. And the first is, it's really exciting. We're still in this age of discovery of migration, especially the details of migration. And I think that is just inspiring to be around right now and to kind of be in this world of seeing new migrations and learning about where these animals move. A lot of our research has shown us how seasonal habitat, the green wave, and memory and culture and learning in these animals underlie where they go. But we also have done a lot of research now that kind of identifies how development is influencing the movement, the migration of these animals. And most importantly is I think we've very clearly demonstrated, and we're using them day to day now, these maps of migration corridors and stopovers. And those maps can now be used to prioritize conservation efforts, identify conservation opportunities, and identify where risks potentially are in the future. And I think we have a ton of policy momentum at the state and federal level. A whole bunch of states in the West now have migration policies after what Wyoming has done. We still have the federal policy, even though the administration has changed. That secretarial order is still somewhat enacted, and so that's good. But we still have a lot of work to do. There's this clear disconnect between the data that's coming in and the research compared to what's actually happening on the ground, and designation of corridors and identification of corridors. But we're getting there, and I think it's exciting time. And I just want to leave you off with this kind of inspiring thing that I think migrations are bipartisan. Migrations bring us together. Migrations bring states together, different countries together, the tribes and the states. And I think this is just an inspiring tale of how migration can bring us together, particularly in this time where I feel like we're more and more apart. Here I am sitting by myself in my office. And so I hope that's inspiring to you from a conservation perspective, and thinking about what has come from in your own backyards here in Western Wyoming. So thank you very much. And if we have a few minutes for questions, I know it was started a little bit late, but I'd be happy to answer a few.
Oh yeah, we'll be happy to throw some questions at you, Jared. First, let me thank you very much. And let me also make a pitch, which is obviously there's a lot of funding sources and a lot of agencies that are participating. But if you could tell us how we could best help support this work, that would be, I think, welcome to any number of us listening.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think there's a lot of different options. I think it depends on your interest. If you're interested in kind of the research, mapping, providing the tools end, probably supporting the Wyoming Migration Initiative or work that comes kind of under the Wyoming Migration Initiative is important. If you're more interested on the ground efforts and helping to facilitate conservation easements or fencing projects, I think you need to look at your more local land trust and make sure that you're you say, hey, we're interested in supporting conservation related to migration. And so I think I see those two avenues as probably the main two that you can think about. And talk to your local biologist too, because they may, like Allie, will know what kind of efforts are happening at that time. And
Yep.
She might be able to tell you, oh, here's where you might be able to plug in some funds or help support this effort or that effort. You know what I mean? Things change year to year. And
Yep.
so it could bounce around. So consider that as well.
Okay. Well, I got a couple of questions.
Okay.
And let's start with, I've got a question of, apparently there's a small herd of mule deer who move back and forth between Moose and sometimes further north in Jackson. Do you know about that? Is the movement seasonal, and are they counted along with your long migrating herds? Are you aware of that group?
Yeah, I am a little bit. I just was looking at, so I think about, I can't remember how many years ago, but there was a study led by the Teton schools, and it was really focused on roads. And so a bunch of animals were a bunch of mule deer, I think about 40 of them were captured around Jackson and south of Jackson. And about half of those animals did migrate west and kind of north towards the Tetons, and they moved through those areas. And so, yes, we did document some of those migrations. I don't think they should be online in the third volume, because we just mapped some of those. So you should be able to see those in the third volume of the report. But it's not, it was a little bit of a different study because the collars were kind of put out across, different areas south of Jackson and around Jackson. So it's not like this, all the animals coming onto one area. You'll see kind of a mess of where they go, if that makes sense. Because some migrate northwest, some go southwest, and I think some even stay pretty resident as well, as you know.
Got another question. Wyoming and Idaho seem to have lots of migrations. Is that because they have more animals or because they are better researched?
That's a good question. I don't think it's because they have any more migrations than others. I mean, Utah has a whole bunch of migrations as well. I think it might be the structure more of kind of the politics of who collects data and who thinks it's important and just the timing. And I think Idaho and Wyoming have just kind of prioritized it, from the state to the researchers to the federal land agencies have pushed it. And I think that it just happens to be that Wyoming and Idaho are kind of ahead in that game. I think we'll see Utah suddenly Utah, we're going to see a lot. Montana has a ton of migrations. They're just kind of working out how they want to present them to the public and present them to the world, if that makes sense. And so it's just kind of a timing thing more than any specific thing with respect to Idaho and Wyoming.
I'm sure you know that the Teton Range bighorn sheep lost their migration route maybe 100 years ago. There is an effort to try to increase the herd. Do you think they will ever learn to migrate lower if some of the hazards are removed?
That's a good question.
I see Doug McWhirter is on. Doug,
yeah, I see Allie and Doug.
Yeah.
Let me just speculate. I don't know the details of this herd, but based on what we know, if they do learn it, it's going to take decades. It'll be a lifetime for us. And we don't know much about if we can facilitate learning. I mean, it would be really neat if we could somehow help animals learn that there's new habitat available now or something, but we don't have a lot of those kind of tools put together yet. One thing that we know from a few different studies is that movement of animals sometimes is sparked by density or by weather events. And so if there's a situation where the higher elevations just get a huge amount of snow, they might push them out in a way that they kind of discover new things. Or if the population density gets high enough that kind of animals are dispersing. Does that make sense? So it might take some things on the landscape to change in order for the animals to discover and potentially learn it. But it's hard to predict when those things are going to occur and how that's going to unfold.
Thanks. Jared, in your mapping work, is there a potential for identifying fence locations through animal behavior or other methods?
Yeah, so
go ahead.
Great question. There's probably many of you have heard of Arthur Middleton, who's also a researcher in the kind of GYE area. He has a student that actually developed a methodology that looks at GPS, like the points of these animals and what happens when they hit a potential fence. If they go back and forth, or if they just cross it, or if they bounce off of it. And so there are some things we can do to potentially identify where problem fences are. We haven't done kind of a full-on assessment of that, but we have the tools generally. Now, this works best when we have something like hourly data or less, because as you can imagine, a lot can happen when you all know this. You see an animal at a fence. Sometimes maybe they have trouble with it for 5 minutes and they move through. And so if we have a point an hour before and an hour after, we don't have a lot of information about how exactly they moved across. And so a lot of the data sets, we have 2, 3, 4 hour data. And that's just too coarse for us to really understand how they move across a fence. But as technology is going to get better, we're going to have more fine scale data. And I think we'll be able to uncover some of those things at a broader scale soon, I'm sure.
Jared, what do you know about who's using your data sets and your maps? Or do you have that information? Do you know if the hunting community is using them, or are you collecting that information in any way?
We're not collecting that information specifically. We do, for those of you that went to Western migrations, we do ask for your email address. And we can track what you do on the site, but nobody has really done any kind of analysis of that per se. Okay.
How effective are the tunnels and crossovers in aiding animal migration?
Oh, if the crossovers are built properly and they're wide enough or tall enough for underpasses, they work great. Well, excuse me, wide enough, tall enough, and they have the correct fencing to help funnel the animals to them. They work great. And I think anybody that's, I haven't, I'm not a field biologist, so I haven't watched the behavior of the animals when the Pinedale overpasses went in. But my understanding is that, at first it took a little while to kind of figure it out, but now that they know that spot is there, they zip right across and there's no problems. And so as long as they're built, we have enough of these over and underpasses built now that it's pretty clear what works. And I don't know the dimensions and the sizes specifically, but we have a pretty good pathway of what works and what doesn't. And once they're built the correct way, they can reduce road kills to 99% reduce them, because you're basically keeping the animals off the road and correctly crossing properly. And one thing that I've been hearing recently is that the fencing is one of the most important things, because you put the overpass and then you have to have fencing to kind of funnel them there, or at least make sure they're not crossing in other areas. And that has to be just as thoughtfully put together. Like how many miles on either side of the overpass should the fencing be? Because if the animal hits the fence and turns the wrong way and ends up trying to cross at the end of the fence far from the overpass, we've not quite done it right. Does that make sense? So we need to be, the fencing itself is actually very thoughtful in, or very important in putting together and making sure those over and underpasses are effective.
It looks from your partner list that I noticed that Nevada DOT is on there, and there's a few others. Are you having success in working with the state departments of transportation? Are they, I know YDOT's been very engaged, but are you finding that some of the other states are getting their DOTs involved?
Yeah, well, yes. And I think Nevada just happens to be one of the states where the DOT and the Game and Fish Department just have a great relationship, and they've done some amazing things there. But I think what we have coming down the pipe here that's even going to facilitate it more is the infrastructure bill has like $350 million for wildlife crossing conservation type work. And when you look at that, how that money is going to be given out, it's going to be given out to collaborative projects between the State Wildlife Agency and the Department of Transportation, which I believe will probably facilitate a lot of great collaboration. And then when that occurs, then it's like, oh, we have the data and we're kind of in this kind of great situation to, make some progress on overpasses and underpasses and wildlife crossing. So I think there's a lot of good momentum, and I think we will only see more in the future.
I've got two more for you. How stressful is it for the animals to be collared?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there is some level of stress. We are capturing the animals, putting them in a helicopter, and then we handle them for 20 to 30 minutes. And that is definitely a stress on these animals. And what I think is a good component of this is we've done, the researchers alongside Wyoming Game and Fish Department have reviewed as much research all the research that's been done on drugging, on captures, on all the ways to minimize the effect on the animals. And I think of all my experience, I've worked in different states and with different species. What we have going on in Wyoming is one of the best systems, with Kevin Monteith and Wyoming Game and Fish. They do excellent capture work, and we have a lower, capture mortality rate than other states have. And so we're doing a good job kind of bringing in the best knowledge and the best science we have. But you're right, it is a bit stressful for those animals at some level, and we manage that as best we can with the data the research that we know about and we have.
And I've got one more for you. As you look in more detail at your migration data, are you starting to take into account seasonal climatic influences, e.g. drought in an area versus more precipitation and forage in others? I think we're talking about climate modeling here.
Yeah, we've done a little bit. So a student of Matt Kaufman's, who just graduated a couple years ago, worked on this in a couple of in the Wyoming range, the mule deer in the Wyoming range. And what we find is that the drought or climate change, what it does is it kind of changes how that green wave moves up in elevation for us. And so, the vision is that it's this smooth green wave and the animals can just, every day get a little higher in elevation. But what these kind of dry, warmer springs make for us is this green wave that goes either really fast or it's really complicated. For instance, the south facing slopes could be green and warm, but the north facing slopes still have 3 feet of snow. And so what it does is it makes the green wave more complicated. And what we find is that the animals in those situations, when we have drought-like springs, the animals just don't get as much forage as they move up in elevation. So they're doing as best they can, but the climate or like that weather patterns, those kind of drought springs kind of compress the green wave. And so there's just less for them to take advantage of. So that's kind of the main research we have on climate change and migration specifically, but there's a lot of broader things you can think about. Changing snow conditions maybe could be better for some wildlife. And so, there's kind of some different components, and it's complicated. And I'm sure over the years, we're going to see more research coming out, kind of detailing how the changing weather patterns that we have will influence these migratory animals.
Jared, thank you very much. This is great. And I urge everybody, if you haven't had a chance already, to go to migrationinitiative.org, and you can get access to all of this stuff by clicking through a couple of links from there. And it's just, it's a fabulous piece of work, and it means a lot going into the future for preserving migration routes and preserving these herds. And it's so great to see it expanding to the rest of the West, which is just exploding in population and development. So it's important work, and thank you so much.
You're very welcome, Bernie, and everybody. Thanks for having me, and I hope you enjoyed the stories and the maps, and have a wonderful evening.
Thanks for tuning in, everybody.
Yep. Thanks for the bird sightings too. I kind of like that. I don't get that every day.
Send them in.
See you later.
Bye, everybody.
Good to see you, Renee. Bye.
Yep.